Hey YouTube, I've done some videos before on common mistakes of governor linkages and throttle linkages for Briggs and Kawasaki motors, and just some general pointers on where pieces go. People tend to take them off and then they forget when they go to put it back together. I've never actually done one on how to assemble a whole engine. This will be most of that. I'm not going to go down to the shrouds and the muffler and everything else. You can figure those out. They only go on one way. But I bought this motor, or acquired this motor. A guy, from the sounds of it, broke a rod, which is pretty common in these motors. And he bought the parts to try and repair it himself and couldn't get it running. And he got so fed up with it, he just went and bought a whole new tractor. Now, if you've got the money, that's a acceptable result. Some people want new tractors. I would love one, but some people want to fix them and don't see them go in the junkyards. So that's me. The reason I'm doing this video is because there was so much wrong with this motor inside. It's clear that people are struggling with where parts go, how to set timing, how to identify which part goes where. So this is your basic tips, tricks, how-to for assembling this motor. Most of it is applicable to all small engines. This is specifically I think it was a 22 horse Briggs Intech V-twin. It's the 44 cubic inch, so anything in that size frame. Actually, it's pretty close to the Vanguards and everything down to the 30 cubic inch as well. So we got our block prepped. I took it all apart, tore it all down. He actually did buy a lot of new parts. He bought brand new pistons. I can't see what's in the camera. He bought brand new pistons. They're all shiny, nice. New rods, brand new ring set. So I took it apart. I can see one of the cylinders did have a broken rod in it. There's some light scuffs in the cylinder, but I did a light surface hone with just a drill mounted hone. You can get them at AutoZone, Napa, wherever. They're pretty cheap. Does a really good job of just adding the crosshatch back into your cylinder when you're going to put new rings in. It helps seat them so that you don't have high oil consumption, low compression, you name it. After I honed it, those surface scratches, they're still somewhat visible in the one cylinder, but my general rule of thumb is if you can't catch your fingernail on it, it's probably in the sub 5/1000ths of an inch range, so they're not going to cause any issue. Now, if there's a gouge, yeah, you're going to have excessive oil consumption, low compression, low power. It may run, but it may not be ideal. So this one I deemed as still acceptable. The block wasn't worth tossing. So we've cleaned it all up. Everything is cleaned out inside, and now we're ready to do some assembly. So first thing that I saw wrong when I took this out was, if you notice, these rods have a number on them. Sorry if I sound funny. I'm trying to see in my camera behind me. So you see that number 2, and then there's a number 1 right here. Those numbers, when you put them in the block, tell you what side they go in. So the rods, there's only one part number. It's the same rod for both cylinders, but they're a different shape. So you notice this is not symmetrical. The way you determine which one goes where is that number should be facing out for whatever cylinder side it's on. So if you look on the top of the block, there's an ID. I don't know if you can see it. My hands, there's a number 2 right here and a number 1 right here. It's stamped into the block. So this is cylinder 2 and this is cylinder 1. So when you're building cylinder 2, you want number 2 facing out. For cylinder 1, you want number 1 facing out. This guy had those backwards. Another great way to tell is when you put 2 pistons into one engine, these parts are going to be rubbing on each other or spinning on the same crankshaft. You would want a smooth surface to be rubbing on each other. One side of the rod is as cast, it's rough. The other side is machined smooth. You always want the 2 machined surfaces together. So that's another helpful way to figure that out. The other thing I saw that he did wrong was the pistons have a direction to them. I don't know if you can see. Let's see. There's an arrow. That arrow points to the flywheel. So when you have them in, so cylinder 1 facing out, I want that arrow pointing back to the flywheel. So this one is set up for cylinder 1. he had them in, I forget which way, but the arrow was pointing the wrong way. Again, doesn't make a huge difference, but there's subtle balancing and machining issues that want them to be oriented a certain way, and that's why they stamped that right in the top of the piston. The other thing that I saw that he did wrong is he had the rings in backwards. Now there is a proper orientation for rings. Every time you order a set of piston rings, they come with a little sheet that'll tell you how to orient them. So you got your oil ring for the bottom, your second compression ring, and your main compression ring for the top. These have been worn off a little. I don't know if you'll be able to see them, but sometimes you'll see some paint markings on the side. You'll see a little dimple or a witness mark on the inside. Or if you look real careful, let's see if oh, sorry, I was probably off camera for that. I was pointing to the edge of the ring right here where you'll see paint or the dimple. The other thing you might see is, I don't know if you can see that or not, the end of the ring right here, it's got a notch cut on the inside. Sometimes they're square, sometimes they are, let's see if I can get close on that. Sometimes it's a bevel. This one happens to be a bevel. There, I don't know if you can see it or not, right on this inside corner. So the main thing is to look at your sheet and see which way goes up. So assembling these, first thing, you always want a little oil on it. You don't want to put dry rings on a dry piston. So I just take a cap full of oil, pour it on top, rub it around, and now when I put my rings in, that'll spread all that around, and I'll put a little more on before we assemble it. First thing, take this wrinkly looking ring. This is for your oil ring and your oil groove. Snap that in. It's real light, real flimsy, be careful with it. You've got two scraper rings. These are the real thin ones. These go in the same way. So you've got 3 parts that go in your oil ring. Make sure you keep all these separations separate, stagger them. You don't want them all in the same order. The other important thing is to start one edge and then walk it around. Don't try and stretch your ring out to go over. These steel ones aren't a big deal, but with the main compression rings, they're hardened, they'll snap right in half. So you take the other one in, put it in, give it a spin to make sure nothing's binding, and you've got your oil ring set up. I don't know if you can see that. It's in there all nice. So the second one, start bottom, go to top. It's always easiest than skipping a ring or skipping over. So I showed you that little notch that was on the bottom of this ring. For Briggs, on the bottom ring, you want that bevel down. So this inside bottom is beveled. So I want that on this bottom edge. Now that spins nicely. Get that oil moved around in there. For the top one, for your main compression ring, you want the bevel up. And that will be said in Briggs, you always want bevel up. So you can kind of see it right there. Bevel up. Walk your ring around, give it a spin. Now everything's in there all nice. Now, the other thing you want to do is make sure you place your rings correctly. One thing I didn't show you is I checked a ring gap. Before you assemble them to your piston, you take your ring, put it in the bore with no piston, and check the gap between these ends. There is a spec for that. Every manufacturer is different. You want to make sure that you've got the right end gap so that you don't have blow-by or compression loss. Now, most manufacturers will tell you exactly where to place each gap on each ring. I find it impossible to get them to stay in position. When I'm assembling it, they always move. So I just alternate them. The one things to remember, you don't want all the gaps in one line. You don't want gaps on the skirts. And you don't want them on the edge. So I kind of alternate them on the 4 corners, if that makes sense. Put one there, one opposite over here. And then the oil ring can be kind of anywhere. Oil ring isn't quite as important. So that piston's set up. This is my other one. I already oiled them and assembled them. I'm just going to give it another little shot of oil before I put it into the engine. Make sure we don't have any dry rings or anything in there. So get those nice and alternated. The other thing, you can rub some oil on the skirts. Make sure you don't have a dry piston edge when you put them in. A lot of people will use oil when they put their pistons into the cylinder. They just rub the cylinder down with oil. I prefer using this or something similar. It's assembly lube, engine, well, where's the English one? Motor assembly lube from Lubriplate. I think this was like $8 at Napa, maybe even cheaper. It lasts a long time. Don't be cheap. Just buy some of this. I've had this one for a year now, and it still feels full. The nice thing is it sticks. It doesn't run out. It stays in place, and it's real thick, filmy. So during that initial startup, it keeps things lubricated before your pump can pump some oil up. The worst thing is running metal on metal before the oil gets there. A lot of your wear on your engines happens at first startup or initial rebuild. One last thing before I forget and put these in. Your rod and cap have an orientation to them as well. If you look on this rod, this little projection right here, that has to mate with this projection on the cap. See on this side there isn't one, and over here there isn't one either. So when you put them together, you want those projections together. And when one thing to notice, this is my machined piston rod. The cap has no machined surface on either side. They're narrower than the rod itself, so they actually won't rub on anything, so it's fine. Don't get confused by that. You put the raised parts together. Also, don't swap your rod caps. So don't take them apart, put them on the table, and forget which rod it came from. They're sized and lapped to be the perfect diameter. They might be off slightly if you mix them up. So make sure you keep the right ones together. So we'll take a little bit of my assembly lube. I already did the cylinder bores, but I have not done the rods. I got a nice clean rod. Put some assembly lube in there. Do the same for the cap. Nice clean cap. Can be liberal. I found that the stuff, when you first start up the engine, it makes it smoke a little because it's burning off all the stuff that's up in the cylinders and all over the place. It's fine. A few minutes of smoke is well worth it to know that your engine's not going to burn up on you. So take note. We got, see if you can see the arrow pointing that way. And we got our number 1 over here. So this is cylinder 1. So what you want to do, sorry, I forgot this. Crankshaft, pre-lubed. My journal is all nice. I did up here, I did the bearing in the block. So we slide this through. Make sure you lube and replace your upper PTO seal. The upper one doesn't leak because all the oil's on the bottom, but it just makes good sense to replace it now. So now we'll take our piston. Apologize for my messy workbench, too many things going on. I'll slide this down into the cylinder. And should probably take off my head gasket that I just have sitting there in place right now. So now you can get ring tools, ring compressors. I have one. I don't use it. I just find it to be sort of tedious, and it doesn't seem to work all that well on these little engines for some reason. So try not to scream at me if you're an engine builder. I use a screwdriver, but I'm very careful. So you just carefully walk one ring in at a time. Start at the back, furthest away from the hands are all gooped up with that lube. Furthest away from the opening in the ring. Just walk it around. Now, it wants to pop down. So we got the first scraper ring, the middle piece in. Now we're on the second scraper ring. And there is a slight bevel to the top of the block. It's just not as good as it should be. It doesn't want to walk itself in. Okay, So we're done with the oil ring. Now we're on to the compression ring. So again, my slot is over here, so I'm starting at the back. Push that down. Walk my ring around. You can actually do it with your fingernails if they're long enough, which mine are borderline. So there. The last one, slot up here, so I start in the back. Walk my ring around. And if we're lucky, pop it into place. So that cylinder is in. Now you have to make sure that your rod lines up nicely. Do everything slow and by hand. Jiggle it. Make sure that things are loose. You don't want to have anything binding in there. Now make sure you look for where the dimple on your cap goes. Get your 2 screws. Line up your cap. And get your screw in there. And I usually drop these like that a few times before I actually get them in place. My socket. Normally I would be washing my hands a lot more between this so that my hands aren't all slippery, but I didn't do that, so I apologize. I'll try and edit some of this out so it goes quicker in the actual video. Well, this is important. You know how I told you not to mess up which rod cap goes with your piston? I did, and I didn't tell you. And I was hoping this wouldn't happen, but I got them on wrong. I can tell this is not the match set because when I just barely snug up those cap bolts, the cylinder, the crank doesn't want to turn over. So that tells me that's not the right set. So that's something you can check when you put it together. I guess it's a happy accident that happened, so yeah, you can see that. Don't do that. All right, so I got the other rod cap on. I don't know if you can hear it, but I'm sliding the piston rod back and forth just slightly, and now it moves. Now I can grab this and it turns. So I had it on the wrong one. I did exactly what I said not to do, but that's what happens when I'm trying to organize a bunch of parts. So now we'll get the other piston in. Arrow pointing out. Number 2 facing out for the number 2 piston. Take off your head gasket. Slide it in. Make sure you get the rod in the right place so you aren't jamming it into the crank down there. Get your oil ring in place. Okay, got the other piston in. Again, line up your high points and get your other rod cap put into place. All right, sorry I had a visitor knock on my door, so I had to go answer the door. So I prepped a couple of things while I had the camera off. I got both rods in. I torqued the rod caps down to spec. Next part will be getting the camshaft and timing set and getting your lifters put in. So I've already put in 3 of the lifters. I'll show you the last one. So I lubed up the lifter with my same grease, my same assembly lube that I put on everything else. Nice thing about this, the assembly lube is tacky enough, it holds them in place so gravity won't make them fall out on you while you're getting everything in place. If you're just using plain oil, you can just turn the motor upside down, set it on these 2 points, and then gravity isn't an issue. Camshaft, lobes are all in good shape. Lubed those up so that nothing happens to those. Important thing here is we're going to have to set timing. This is another thing the guy had wrong. He was close, but I think it was accidental. Because if he knew what if he got that close, he would have just done it right. So on this cam, you can see this dot right here. There's a matching dot on this gear on the crankshaft right here. So what you want to do before you put everything in is get that dot facing straight up. And then you put your camshaft in with that dot facing straight down, and then everything will line up. There we go. I'll take the camera so you can see. And you can see here's a dot here, and here's a dot here. You want those teeth right in place. You don't want to be 1 tooth over, you don't want to be 2 teeth over. It has to be dead on, or you will end up with your timing off. And I suspect that is probably why he made this nice bent pool Q push rod. It doesn't take long. It's not like 5 minutes of running and this happens. It's turn the engine over 1 time and that happens if you got things in the wrong place. He also had incorrect push rods. I guess while we're talking about that, there's different kinds of push rods for this, for your intake and your exhaust. If you can see these, there is an aluminum one and a steel one. They're both the same length, but one is steel and one's aluminum. The aluminum one goes on your intake, steel goes on your exhaust. Don't mess them up, and don't do what he did. He must have been short. He put 3 steel and 1 aluminum in. And the way to tell if you forget, when you put your push rods in, they'll go through the holes in this head right here. Exhaust, steel one goes on this side. Intake over here. This is your intake side. That's where your aluminum one goes. Make sure you don't mess that up. Also, make sure we set our timing just right. Otherwise, we'll have more issues. Or set our valve clearance correctly. Okay, so we've got everything assembled into the engine. Lifters are in place. While I had this off, you can see this purple stuff around the edge. That is this stuff. Loctite, high-tech, it's gasket dressing. It's not necessary, but I like using it. It's really nice on cars for like water pumps. It helps a vertical gasket stay in place and all the holes aligned, so you don't have to try and hold it in place, put your cover on, and still maintain all bolt holes without it, falling down on you. It also sort of seals and dresses the gasket so that you don't have any dry spots where oil might leak out or get folds. So here is my sump. It's all cleaned out, all nice. I got my gasket on already. This already has the same gasket sealant on the other side. I make my own gaskets, partly because I'm, maybe a little cheap, but I don't like paying $30 for a cardboard gasket. This is not $30 worth of material, and that's about what they cost. They're not hard to make. You trace it out, cut it with an X-Acto knife, good to go. And this way I can actually buy good material. The ones you buy come folded sometimes, they come creased. They're cheap, thin material. I just go and I buy Felpro gasket material, and I can get any thickness I want. This is the Felpro Caro Pack. It's a glorified cereal box. If you're in a pinch, you could use a cereal box. I wouldn't recommend it. I've lubed the inside where the crank goes. I've lubed the crank, lubed the end of the camshaft. The oil pump is removed. You have to remove that, otherwise the slot on your camshaft will not line up. I suppose you might get lucky and it would line up. It'd be incredibly rare. I've never been lucky enough. So slide this on into place. Also pre-lube your PTO gasket on the bottom so that that goes on nicely. Make sure your governor arm is in the correct place so it doesn't get bound. And then slowly and carefully push it on so that you don't wrinkle the edges of your gasket. Get your dowel pins lined up and slide it on. Make sure you do this step before you put your push rods and your springs in with your head. If you set your rockers on, it puts too much pressure on the camshaft and it's pushing down, and it won't allow this plate to go on. You'll booger up your dowel pins. It won't want to align on you unless you're, I don't know, Hulk Hogan or something. It just doesn't work out, so don't do that. Get your block bolts. Put them all back in. Torque sequence for these and a torque limit too. I'll probably fast forward while I tighten them so you don't have to watch, but those on. I've got my head gaskets on. I put those in place already. I cleaned up the bottoms of my heads. Got my dowel pins in place. So you can set your, oops, putting them on now. Sorry, pay attention. Got the wrong one, that's why. There's no markings on your heads. There's no cast-in mark that I can find on them. I don't know of one anyway. But the way you know, spark plug goes out, exhaust on the bottom. So here's your exhaust port. Intake goes to the middle for your carburetor, and also the dowel pins help. You can't put them on the wrong way. They're keyed so that nothing ever gets in the wrong place. So put those on, get your head bolts. Make sure you find the clean one that was inside. There's one that goes inside the heads, not on the outside, so it should have a clean top. No point putting a dirty one in there, I'll just get crap in your oil. Thank God he didn't put RTV on this. He did on the valve covers. But get these on, I'll show you how to set the timing, or the, keep saying timing, I'll show you how to set the valve clearance. And I think the rest should be pretty self-explanatory. You can watch my other videos if you want to see how to set up your governed idle springs, how to set the position of the governor. I know everybody struggles with that one too. It's really easy. It's just, I don't know, you got to do it a few times and then it makes more sense. Oh, something I didn't show you. The heads on here were fine, but I always, when I have an engine apart, I just feel like I may as well do everything while I'm in there. So I hone the cylinders and then I usually lap the valves. It's pretty crude, but go to the store, buy one of these. It's a suction cup on either end and some valve grinding compound. It's dirt cheap. It lasts forever. You treat it like you're starting a fire with a stick. What it does is it's an abrasive compound that mates the, oops, that's my clean one, that mates your valve seat to your valve. It just revives the seal and makes sure that you've got great sealing performance there so that you don't have any blow-by or leaks that would cause performance issues. So real easy, just make sure you wash it off, carb cleaner, parts cleaner, whatever. It is abrasive, so you don't want the stuff getting inside your engine. So make sure you do 2 rounds, don't go for the gold on the first one and over tighten. You can warp these, they're aluminum. You can warp a head pretty easy, and then it doesn't matter how good your base or your head gasket is, it'll never seal right. It's a common problem with Kawasaki's for some reason. I don't know if it's from the bolt torques or if it's just the head's warped from casting or heat. But if you take your head off, and throw a straight edge across it, you'll see that they're quite often not flat. And then you either have to buy a new head, get your head machined, which is not the best option because then you've got a different combustion chamber than the other side. Or you can do what our friend did and just hoop it up with RTV and hope for the best, which I would recommend. Jump on eBay and find a used head. There's always somebody selling used parts on eBay for cheap. You can usually buy a head for one of these motors for $50. That'll come with valves and valve springs and retainers. All you have to do is dress your valves. Okay, good enough for now until I find my torque spec later. Your rods, again, one steel, one aluminum. Steel goes on your exhaust side, aluminum intake side. So get this pointed over here. It's hard to see, but you can see your valve down inside, your lifter, I mean. Sometimes the tips of these rods are magnetic. You can just set them in there for now. Then get your rockers, your rocker and your bolt. Again, these have a torque spec, and I'm sorry I didn't review what they are. I'll go find them. The part with the bolt and nut goes on your rocker. You can leave the push rod out for now. Just get these in. So see, I've got it off to the side right now. Just wiping off some of the oil that was on these from sitting here. And what you can do, let's get these in. Thought it was an 8mm. It's a 5/16 socket. Kind of surprising. Most of the stuff on these engines is all SAE. I don't know why. The rod bolts are all metric, but everything else on these is English. And I think Vanguards are all metric. Not sure why the switch, but so these will still be loose. They're just sitting on. There's a post that they're torqued down onto. And now what you can do, get a Torx bit. Find what drawer they're in. There you go, it's out because I use it so much. So I need a Torx bit to go in here, and actually I don't really need this, I just need it to loosen it. And I think after I just told you everything is English, I believe this is a 13mm, yep. So I just need the ratchet to loosen it initially. Loosen your nut. Now this will spin freely, so. So now what I do is I usually back everything out a little bit. Make sure you start loose. So now you can usually push down on the spring and pull up here. And then you can snap your push rod underneath. Depending where you are on the stroke. The exhaust one just pops in real easy. This one went in harder. So now what we need to do, on this one, I'll do the other one later. I'll set one. I'm not going to set both on here. It'll take too long. You need to find you want top dead center of your compression stroke. I think fault this guy had here was he didn't find top dead center, or I don't know if he even looked, if he just threw them in and thought he could set them anywhere. You need top dead center of the compression stroke so that you're on the round part of the lobe. These camshafts, they have a compression release built into them. It's ground into the shaft, so if you're not in the perfect place, the cam lobe could be, it looks round, but it could actually be holding the valve just slightly open to relieve some pressure during start. Otherwise, you'd need that really high torque battery, or high torque starter. So the way you find where this goes, your engine turns clockwise. So what you need to do is there's 4 strokes: intake, compression, power, and exhaust. So right now I'm turning clockwise, and you can see my intake valve is down. So that means it was pulling in air from the intake. So this is your intake stroke. It's now closing, and it's now coming up. This is the compression stroke. And now this just got loose. It was under tension or compression. And now if you watch, there goes, this one's starting to move. So we've now hit the bottom of the compression stroke and it's now the exhaust stroke. So we want to go back. So here's your intake. Your intake valve is open, closing. And now you want top dead center. We're now on the compression stroke. We're compressing the gas that it just pulled in. So we want to get to top dead center. And if you're scared that you won't get it right, you can put a screwdriver in here lightly. Touch the piston. Do not touch the cylinder wall so you don't scratch it. Turn it until the screwdriver comes up and stops. Once you go into your power stroke, it's going to start moving away. So now it's moving away from me. Here's the top. You want it right at top. If you're in the right place, both of these should be loose. If they're maladjusted, they may be too tight, but what you want to do, get a feeler gauge. The specs for these are 4 thousandths for one and 6 for the other, I believe, but there's a range, and what I typically do is just set everything at 5. Just makes it easier, and I've never had a problem. So I think it's like 4 to 6 and 5 to 8, I can't remember, but put your feeler gauge between the rocker and your valve stem. And then you take your Torx bit and turn it. Sorry, we're doing both of them right now. So you set this one. So now it got tight. Back off just a hair. So you want to set this until it's just grazing, so you can just slide it in. You don't want any space. What I typically do is set it just a little bit one way or the other, because right now this jack nut or whatever, this lock nut is loose. The only thing holding it in place is the fact that I've got some tension on that screw. The second I turn the engine on, it would come out of place and all your valve adjustments would be off. So now you have to lock this down. And actually what I want to do is go a hair loose, because what will happen is when I turn this nut to lock it, it's going to continue to turn the adjustment further ahead. It's a little bit of trial and error, but get that in place. And now I hold it so that it doesn't turn. Snug it up before it's too tight. Make sure. So I did get a hair looser. It's still pretty good. You can hear it lightly dragging. Take your tools off so there isn't weight hanging on it. Jiggle them around to make sure they're not bound. So it's just a hair looser than I want. So now that the tightening nut is slightly tightened, I can actually rotate the whole thing just a hair still. And I can get my extra, too much. Just barely touch it. So right like that. The reason you want it to be so precise is because when things heat up in your engine, those rods change length. They grow, they get longer. And if they get too long, then your valves never actually close. You need a little bit of clearance so that the valve actually positive closes on the valve seat. If you're pushing down on it, it's always going to hold it open a few thousandths of an inch, and you'll have massive leaks. And also, if it's too loose, then your valves aren't as responsive. They aren't opening when you want them to. So that's why your valve setting is so critical. So this one is actually really close. That's just lucky because I guessed. So if it'll hold itself in there, it's usually just about right. It's just about to fall out. That's how I know it's about the right tightness. Now, that and lock it down. A little snug, check. I loosened it a little bit. Now we're going to give it just a hair. Now you can hear it just barely dragging on there. And it holds itself, but barely. It wants to fall out. So we're in the right spot. Now we should be set. So you just set both your intake and exhaust. Note they're both still loose. That's normal. If they're too loose, your engine won't start. So if you ever have somebody say, I have a really hard time starting my engine even on choke, it won't fire, you can take the valve cover off and check these. They do need adjustment from time to time. Not a lot, but they can change over time. So I think that's about it. Put on a new gasket. Don't use RTV. Don't reuse the old ones. They always leak oil. It won't affect your performance. You'll just get oil all over. I just remembered one other thing I need to do. I took the oil pump out, if you remember I said that. This is the drive shaft. There's two different sides. The big flat one goes into the engine. The smaller one goes into the rotor of your gear pump. This goes in here, and you find it until it locks. See, it's off. You rotate it slightly, and then it will push into place. You're now in the back of the camshaft. So this still has oil on it, and it's been cleaned, so I don't need to relube it. Make sure there's no grit in here. You stick in the outside of the oil pump. Take the inside. This is the part that mates with this shaft. Now you gotta get it started. And then you gotta rotate it around until it finds, I suppose the easier thing to do. Take this piece out. Come on. It's so slippery I can't get in there. My hands are covered in oil. There we go. Put this piece in first. It's easier. Get it lined up. And then you rotate this one until it fits in. So now we're in place. Get a new seal. Sorry, I'm off camera again. Get a new seal on here. Make sure your O-ring sits in where it needs to go. If your O-ring is too small, it'll leak. And I don't know if it was intentional or not, but that is a very custom size O-ring. You can't go buy it at Menards or Home Depot. Every once in a while you might get lucky and find one that fits, but I have not been very lucky. They're usually, it might work in a pinch, but it doesn't fit it properly, so I wouldn't recommend it. Get your bolts in. Now, tighten it down. There's no torque spec for this that I know of. Just use some common sense. It's an aluminum. Don't go too tight. Don't go too loose. And you've just rebuilt your engine. I've got some other things left to do. I obviously have to put my push rods in and set the valves on the other side, put the flywheel and electrical stuff back on, exhaust, carburetor. That's all pretty straightforward. I also have it in my other video if you need to know how to set the governor springs up and get all those in place. If you hadn't broken anything, if you're creative, if you use eBay, if you find used parts, if you have used parts around, a ring set's about 35 bucks if your pistons are good. A rod is about 30 bucks if you didn't damage your cam or your crankshaft. If you take a mower in to be serviced and it's got a broken rod, they'll say toss it. They'll either say get a new mower or get a new engine. A new engine can probably be had for $800 to $1,000 depending on what one you have. Their labor rates to do what I'm doing here, it's one afternoon I'm rebuilding this whole thing, honing it, grinding valves, everything. They would charge you thousands, probably, I don't know how much, 2,500 bucks. My neighbor had a bent push rod and he took it in. They charged him $650 to get a push rod replaced. So that was with a tow, and I think they put a new head on even though they didn't need to. But save yourself some money. This engine's got a lot of use left in it. I don't like seeing them go in the junk pile if they don't need to. So let me know if you got questions, if there's anything I didn't address that you're curious about. Let me know if you disagree with something I did, and I'll try and respond. Thanks.